Power rarely collapses at the moment it becomes weak. More often, it collapses after generations of believing its strength still exists, long after the machinery that produced that strength has quietly stopped functioning the way it once did. An empire that once governed a fifth of humanity through law, engineering, and disciplined administration can continue issuing edicts, deploying legions, and receiving tribute for centuries after the coherence behind those institutions has begun to fracture. This is the story of Rome, not its founding myths, but the long arc by which an empire's own accumulated decisions, made in pursuit of stability, produced the conditions of its erosion. Rome expanded from a single city on the Tiber into a Mediterranean-spanning empire through centuries of conquest, absorbing rival powers and extending citizenship as a tool of integration rather than exclusion. Under Trajan, in the early 2nd century, Roman territory reached its greatest extent, more than 2 million square miles, governing an estimated 70 million people across 3 continents. A dense network of roads, aqueducts, and administrative law bound distant provinces to a single center, while a shared legal framework allowed disputes from Britain to Syria to be resolved through a common system. The Pax Romana held for nearly 200 years, sustained by a professional military, a functioning tax base, and a shared civic identity extended through Roman citizenship. By any formal measure, the empire in this period appeared built to endure indefinitely. The strain accumulated quietly, embedded in the logic of the system that had produced Rome's success in the first place. Roman prosperity had grown dependent on continued conquest. New territory meant new plunder, new slaves, new tax revenue to sustain an expanding administrative and military apparatus. When the frontiers stabilized under Hadrian's more defensive posture and expansion slowed, that revenue stream narrowed. But the fiscal obligations built around decades of growth did not shrink to match it. The state responded by taxing existing provinces more heavily, rather than restructuring an economy built for continuous expansion. Provincial officials adjusted collection practices to targets set in Rome that increasingly ignored local conditions, extracting revenue from communities with less capacity to absorb it each year, while currency debasement quietly eroded the value of the coin those taxes were paid in. Administrative reach across such vast distance became its own burden. A message from the imperial frontier in Britain to the capital could take weeks to arrive, and longer still to receive a response. Governors and generals stationed far from Rome accumulated practical authority, simply because distance made central oversight impossible to sustain in real time. Legionary loyalty, once tied to Roman civic identity, shifted increasingly toward the commanders who paid and provisioned troops directly, as the legions filled their ranks with foreign recruits serving for wages rather than citizenship. By the early 3rd century, imperial authority in the provinces had already begun operating on a delay the center did not fully register. Orders issued in Rome describing a level of central control that conditions on the frontier no longer matched. This delay produced consequences with brutal clarity during the crisis of the 3rd century, when accumulated strain finally outran the empire's capacity to absorb it. Between 235 and 284 CE, more than 20 men claimed the imperial throne, most removed by the same armies that had elevated them. Civil war fractured the chain of command precisely when external pressure, Gothic, Vandal, and Frankish incursions along the Rhine and Danube, required coordinated response. Plague moved through cities whose administrative capacity to manage it had already been hollowed by decades of fiscal extraction. Merchants along the frontier adjusted their trade routes and reserves without waiting for imperial policy to catch up with conditions that had already changed on the ground. Each new emperor, installed by whichever army held the greatest immediate leverage, inherited a treasury, and a frontier already strained by the reign before, with less capacity to address either than the one who came before him. Diocletian's reforms, beginning in 284, addressed the visible symptoms of this fragmentation without resolving its underlying, deeper cause. Dividing the empire into Western and Eastern administrations improved short-term coordination, but formalized a structural division that would later prove impossible to reunify durably. His currency and taxation reforms stabilized the immediate crisis, but they did so by deepening the very administrative apparatus, whose reach had already outpaced what the empire's cohesion could sustain. More officials, more layers of reporting, more distance between the decisions made in the capital and the conditions those decisions were meant to address. Constantine's subsequent consolidation and his elevation of Christianity from a persecuted sect to the empire's favored faith restructured Roman civic identity itself, shifting the source of unifying authority away from the old civic religion that had bound provincial elites to Rome for centuries. The administrative apparatus remained intact. What had quietly narrowed was the shared civic loyalty that apparatus depended on to function without constant coercion. By the 4th century, the Western Empire's legions increasingly consisted of federated barbarian groups serving under treaty rather than conquest, a pragmatic solution to manpower shortages that further blurred the line between Roman authority and the forces meant to enforce it. Recruitment offices filled quotas with soldiers whose primary loyalty ran to their own commanders and kin networks, rather than to a distant emperor whose name changed with unsettling frequency. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 under a general who had at points served within the Roman military system himself, the event exposed, rather than caused the underlying condition, a capital that could no longer summon a defense matching the authority it still formally claimed. Provincial administrators in Gaul and Africa, watching central support arrive later and thinner each year, began negotiating their own accommodations with the same tribal groups Rome no longer reliably held at bay. The Western Empire's final decades did not resemble collapse so much as a slow disaggregation of authority that had, in practice, already dispersed years before any single event made it visible. When the Western imperial line ended formally in 476, with Romulus Augustulus deposed by Odoacer, the event registered in the East and among contemporaries less as rupture than as confirmation of a condition that had been accumulating for a century. Rome had not lost a war it might have won. It had spent generations extending administrative obligations, military dependencies, and fiscal extraction beyond what its own coordination could sustain. And the eventual failure to reverse course had, by 476, already been irreversible for longer than anyone in the Western provinces had been willing to say aloud. Power rarely disappears all at once. More often, it survives long enough to discover that the machinery of empire and the coherence that once justified it were not, in the end, the same thing, and that by the time the difference became undeniable, no single decision remained capable of restoring what had already quietly come apart. The legions kept their standards. The provinces kept sending what tribute they still could. What had already ended was the certainty, held for centuries, that Rome could still restore itself whenever it chose to try. Explore more stories about power, legitimacy, and historical consequence on Timeless Questions.